Endurance Junkie Podcast, episode 116. Hey junkies, how are you doing? My name is Peter, and thanks for joining me on a new episode of the Endurance Junkie Podcast, the show where I will be interviewing some of the fastest, smartest, and most inspiring people active in the endurance world today. Now, every listen means so much to me, so if you end up liking today's interview and think someone else would too, feel free to share it on your own social media channels. That would be awesome, and very much appreciate it. Now, if you have suggestions for possible future guests, you can always shoot me an email to peter@junkiepodcast.com, and I'll try to make it happen. Also, feel free to join me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter if you want to discuss or leave your comments. My handle is Junkie Podcast on all platforms, so it should be nice and easy for us to connect. Now, Ryan Munsey is a former bodybuilder, fitness model, and gym owner who now works as a writer, podcaster, and performance consultant. He's considered a thought leader in the wellness and personal development space, and has worked with professional and Olympic athletes, Navy SEALs, and entrepreneurs, helping them optimize both their minds and their bodies. Now, Ryan recently released his new book called Fuck Your Feelings, and it's a great dive into the neuroscience and the way our emotions work, with plenty of tips and tricks on how we can control our mind to achieve more and succeed in everything we do. So hi Ryan, thanks for coming on the show today. Now, for those of us who don't know you, can you maybe start off by telling us a bit about yourself and your own sporting background?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Peter. I'm excited to be on the Endurance Junkie Podcast. My background, I grew up playing every single sport that had a ball. I played basketball, soccer, baseball, golf, football, and to college, I simply wasn't good enough to play at the college level. I went to school at Clemson University, and if folks aren't familiar with Clemson, it's one of the top athletic programs here in the U.S. So, unfortunately, I wasn't quite that good. And like a lot of athletes at the end of their kind of competitive career, I was looking for a way to fill that competitive void. And for me, that became the weight room. And my best friend from home was actually a year behind me, and he was on the track team at Clemson. So I got to tag along with him. And at the same time I was discovering the weight room and this bodybuilding world, I was also able to tag along with them and study or learn how these coaches were training elite level sprinters and throwers and jumpers. So I'm learning the biomechanics of high performance and a lot of the training modalities and methodologies that went into, creating world-class athletes, for either track or the field events. A lot of the guys that ran the sprints were also football players. So it was a period of a lot of learning and a lot of discovery, a lot of experimentation in terms of, how can I eat? How can I train? And I just became obsessed with this phenomenon that, we could change the way we eat and change the way we train and create an entirely new body for ourselves and be completely different in the way we perform. One of the reasons that I wasn't able to play sports at that level was that I was not strong enough. I was not fast enough. And, through a lot of that training, I became a better athlete. I'm a better athlete now in my mid 30s than I was, in my teenage years and in my younger 20s because of that base of strength that I've built and, the proper biomechanics and all the things that come with, studying what it is that you do and sort of mastering your craft, or I guess I should say working towards mastery of your craft.
Yeah, okay. So were you able to reach that elite level in fitness and bodybuilding?
I don't know if I'd call it elite. As a bodybuilder, I did a few shows and I was lucky enough to meet some people that, pulled me aside and said, look, you're 6'1", and in order for you to compete, if you're not familiar with bodybuilding, that's incredibly tall. Most professional bodybuilders who have success are significantly shorter than that. And just to give you an example or an idea, I mean, if I was going to be a professional bodybuilder at 6'1", I'd be on stage over 250, probably off season. We're talking 300 pounds. And, that's just not somewhere I wanted to go. And so the advice there was, to kind of pivot from being a true bodybuilder and then to get into the physique side of things. And this was like mid 2000s. And this is when, the modeling and physique category was becoming more and more popular in the bodybuilding competitions. So I did that, and it's a much leaner, much less muscular look than the typical bodybuilders. And I won one show there, and was able to compete at an international level show in Los Angeles. And through those competitions, I was offered a modeling contract and eventually moved to New York City to become a fitness and fashion model after college. So I guess that's as close to elite as I was able to get. I did a few things, made a little bit of money, and it wasn't quite what I figured it would be. When I left college, my options were move to New York and pursue this thing. For me, I thought that was going to give me a platform where people would listen. And my other option, leaving school, was to do an internship, be a registered dietitian, and work in a clinical setting. While I was in school, I became very aware of this gap between, the way that we should be eating to take care of ourselves and what was being taught and what the general public knew about how to feed ourselves. We all know how to eat, but very few people know how to properly feed themselves. And, as soon as I realized that gap, that was the thing I wanted to do. I wanted to educate people and help people understand, the right ways to eat and, how they can take their health back into their own hands by being aware and being intentional about the things that they put in their bodies and the way they train. So I really looked at this opportunity to become a model as a reason, as a way to build a platform and a reason for people to listen to me. So, I tried that. And like I said, it wasn't really it didn't turn out to be the world that I thought I was getting into. So that didn't last very long. I ended up moving back home after about a year and started working as a personal trainer and nutritionist. Eventually opened up my own performance training facility.
Okay. Where did that interest in food science and nutrition come from? Was that just purely because you had to figure out what you were eating for bodybuilding and for those physique competitions?
Yeah, that was certainly part of it. Like I said earlier, that period at Clemson where I was, really getting, heavily involved in, lifting weights and training and, all that discovery. I became obsessed with it, and I wanted to change my major. My initial major was packaging science, and I wanted to go exercise physiology, but Clemson didn't have that. So the closest I could get was food science and human nutrition. And that's what I did. So a few years in, I changed majors and just kind of went down that rabbit hole as far as I could go. I ended up taking just about every science class that you can imagine and some that you didn't know existed.
Okay. There's so much available now on the internet and about diets. I mean, you got your low carb, high fats and your paleo diets, your plant-based and all that sort of stuff. What is your take on all these different diets and what would your advice be for endurance athletes who want to figure out what works best for them?
Well, one of the things that really shaped my interest in the food science world and human nutrition world from the very beginning is the fact that I'm the only male in my family who is not diabetic. And couple that with being involved in physique competitions that required maximum muscle mass and minimum body fat. I had a very, very keen interest in carbohydrate metabolism, insulin, fat loss, body composition. So even from that beginning, I had tendencies to lean towards lower carb, ways of eating. The first year of competing, I followed, what would be kind of the typical bodybuilder diet that, may be very similar to the, I guess in my mind, what I would call the old school endurance diet, except maybe higher in protein. But it was very, very much focused on, rice and oats and potatoes and protein sources, very low fat. But I started to just have really low energy levels and low hormone levels. And then I, started reading more about higher fat diets and lower carb diets and carb cycling and ketogenic diets, and started experimenting with all of those and different versions of intermittent fasting. And, I found that lower carbohydrate diets worked very well for me. And over the last decade, most of the people that I've worked with have thrived by reducing their carbohydrates from where they started. Now, there's always exceptions to that, but I think, and what I've seen over the years is that the intensity with which we train or perform and the frequency that we do that, those are the two variables that dictate carbohydrate level or carbohydrate needs. I think generally speaking, especially in the last few years, we've seen a lot of research that shows that we want to eat as few carbohydrates as possible over the course of our lifetime. So the idea is to find that minimum effective dose for all of us. Longevity and anti-aging and careful about trying to say disease states and things like that. But we know long-term health is most benefited by that minimum effective dose of carbohydrates. And again, what that number is highly individual. So I'm not dogmatic in saying like, oh, everyone should eat paleo or everyone should eat low carb or everyone should be keto. But I think, like I said, the intensity and the frequency with which we train will determine what that minimum effective dose is for all of us. So to give you an example, somebody who does CrossFit 3 times or 4 times a week is probably going to have a higher demand for glycogen or carbohydrates than somebody who's doing yoga 4 or 5 days a week and that's it. As far as endurance people go, I've seen a huge shift in the last few years of people gravitating towards ketogenic diets, and it makes a lot of sense. If you're teaching your body to be fat adapted, you have this infinite fuel reserve that never runs out. If you think about glycogen, which is stored carbohydrates, the more muscle you have, the more glycogen capacity we have. So you can store more carbohydrates in your muscles as energy for later with greater muscle mass. Well, greater muscle mass is more metabolically active mass that you have to carry around as an endurance athlete. So there's a cost benefit analysis that we have to do there. Do I really want to lug around an extra 20, 30, 40 pounds of muscle as an endurance athlete? And most endurance athletes would say no. You see a lot of very lean physiques in the endurance world, especially those who are incredibly successful. And again, you see minimal body fat, but no matter who you are, we all have excess body fat. And so let's continue with this example of glycogen versus stored body fat for fuel reserves. Let's say you had the capacity to store 200 grams of glycogen or even 300 grams of glycogen. There are 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. So if I can store 300 grams of carbohydrates times 4, that's 1,200 calories that I can store at most in my muscles as glycogen. And your liver also stores some glycogen, but a majority of it is going to be in the muscles. And that's if you, quote unquote, carb loaded, maybe the night before or something like that. Well, let's look at body fat on the other side of that. If we're fat adapted or if we're a ketogenic athlete, we have this unlimited reserve. Stored body fat from a biological purpose is just energy that is in reserve for later use. And as our modern society has evolved, we've really never gotten into these periods of not having food availability. If you look at evolution and our human history, we went through lots of periods of time where, look, let's be honest, up until 50 or 100 years ago, you couldn't walk down the street and acquire food the way you can now. It's on every street corner now. I mean, I'm in the U.S., we've got McDonald's and Walmart and, wherever you want to go, there's food. That has not always been the case. So it's been a survival thing for the human body to store food for later use. And, now that we no longer have these periods without food, we're basically eating all the time. We're never tapping into that reserve, which is why we're getting fatter and fatter. That's one reason. There's a lot of other reasons too. But if you become a fat adapted athlete or a ketogenic athlete, and you don't have to be ketogenic to be fat adapted. Let's be clear about that as well. So there are 9 calories per gram of fat, and there are 400 and some grams in a pound. So if you're a 200-pound athlete at 10% body fat, you have 20 pounds of stored body fat. So 20 pounds times 400 grams times 9 calories. I don't know what that is, but it's a heck of a lot more than 1,200 calories from the carbohydrates we have as glycogen, right? So you can quickly see that we have this unlimited fuel reserve that we could easily tap into. And, this whole idea of like bonking or, this whole industry of goos and gels and bars, that we saw spring up in the 80s and 90s with endurance and marathons and things like that. That's all predicated on somebody being a sugar burner or a carbohydrate dependent athlete, where as soon as you run out of glycogen, you're done unless you can ingest more. Well, if you're a fat adapted athlete, that's not an issue. So I guess that gives you some idea of, how I approach things and how I look at things. I'm more interested in the science of how the human body works and what we are designed to do, and then trying to optimize that natural ability and, make that machine shine and be the star that, look, evolution doesn't make mistakes. We are who we are, and if we can figure out what we're supposed to do and work in line with that as opposed to at odds with it, I think we'll have a lot more success, whether that's as an endurance runner or just trying to be healthy for the long run.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There's also a bit of a trend now that people have their DNA tested to see if they're lactose intolerant or stuff like that. You think that's something that you would advise athletes to do?
I can tell you that doing a food intolerance test was one of the biggest benefits, made some of the biggest benefits for me personally of anything I've ever done. I didn't do the DNA version. So, anything that people can do anything we can do to look into what works well for us and what has a negative impact on us can give us an advantage. I used the Pinner test, and that is a food intolerance test. So the difference between a food intolerance and a food allergy is that a food intolerance takes somewhere between 24 and 72 hours to show up. And it's an IgG reaction that, basically when you eat an offending food, you have, for me, it was incredible joint pain and very sluggish feeling. I used the analogy of feeling like it was Saturday morning and I just played a high school football game the Friday night before. Mm-hmm. And, I'm way too young to be feeling like that on a daily basis and for no reason. It wasn't like I went surfing the day before and got pounded or, I couldn't connect the dots. I couldn't figure out why I was feeling this way. So when I took the food intolerance test, I found out that I have an intolerance to chicken, oats, and egg yolks. And I removed those things immediately. And within days, I instantly felt better. And then this was funny. The very next weekend, I wasn't even thinking about it. I was eating something and I mixed in some Primal Kitchen mayo that was one of my favorite foods. And, a day later, I was just right back to feeling sluggish. And I did this like 3 days in a row. And then on the third day, I grabbed a jar of mayonnaise and I realized, you dumbass, there's egg yolks in here. And, so that was sort of the nail in the coffin, so to speak, where I realized that egg yolks do have, that negative impact on me. So, removing those, ended a lot of joint pain, significant reduction in systemic inflammation, and just a huge jump in my energy levels. So, I would definitely support the idea of exploring, your own food intolerances or your own genetic makeup. This epigenetic component plays a huge part in, optimizing our performance.
Yeah, that's the Pinner test, right? You can just Google Pinner test and you'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah, and I mean, I can send you the link to it if that would help, but it's Pinner test. And I believe I actually interviewed them on my podcast, and I believe there are some places in Europe where that test is covered and you don't have to pay out of pocket. I know, everywhere insurance is a little bit different. But in the US we had to pay out of pocket. But I remember them telling me in some places in Europe that it's covered. So if it's not covered, I think you can use the code. I think you can use my last name, Munsey, and save money. I'm not positive. It's worth a shot.
Yeah, we can check that out and definitely put it in the show notes page. I also read that you're not a real fan of breakfast. Most nutritionists would even call that the most important meal of the day, but you'd rather skip it. Why is that?
Well, like I said, I experimented over the years with almost every version of intermittent fasting, and growing up, I was, the typical, 3 or 4 bowls of cereal and milk and add sugar on top of it, and even if it was a sweetened cereal. And I did that every day until I was 18 or even probably beyond that. But with intermittent fasting, I mean, obviously you're not eating all the time. And I just noticed when I would skip breakfast that, my mental clarity, my focus, my energy levels, everything was sharper and more stable. I didn't have this crash, a few hours after breakfast. I realize not everybody is going to gravitate towards or thrive on an intermittent fasting setup. So my recommendation, if you do eat breakfast, would be to have a low carbohydrate breakfast. And the reason for this is that when we wake up, cortisol is peaking. And, that's the thing that gets us up and gets us out of bed. It is a stress hormone, and it peaks in the morning in conjunction with the sunrise. So this is part of that circadian rhythm or that biological clock. We want cortisol to be at its lowest at the end of the day as we prepare to go to bed. And, when we talk about optimizing sleep or sleep hygiene, part of that pre-bed ritual is to, try to make sure that cortisol is at its lowest or certainly not peaking late in the day. But if it peaks as it should when we wake up, then that also sets off this cascade of, what we could call the perfect storm for muscle preservation and fat burning. It'll set off this hormonal cascade that involves growth hormone and ghrelin. And of course, growth hormone is anti-catabolic, does promote the release of fat for use as fuel. And if we wake up and then immediately eat this carb-heavy breakfast in the morning, not only are we going to get an insulin response, to that carbohydrate load, but we're also going to blunt that fat burning cascade of growth hormone, ghrelin, glucagon. So, and again, this kind of comes back to, my original approach to food, which was for body composition, maximum muscle, minimum body fat, but also, now as we see, this approach for, eating for longevity and brain health and mental performance. So, if you are going to eat breakfast, if you don't want to skip it, then I would recommend protein and fat, but not carbohydrates. And then, if you do want to skip it, you don't have to jump into not eating until noon. Just simply push that first meal back 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, and work your way to, a point that you're comfortable with.
Okay. Well, thanks for your wisdom on that front. Let's move to another topic now. Your book that you recently released called Fuck Your Feelings. What is it about, and why should we all go out and buy a copy?
Well, like I said, I've spent the last 10 plus years in the health and fitness world, whether it's running a gym or being a strength coach or a nutritionist, and at the end of the day, these are all transformations, and I've been able to see a lot of really elite level performers and study and interview world-class athletes, special forces operators, Olympians, and there's a saying that success leaves footprints, and the most successful people have a lot of things in common, and I'm more interested in the things that those folks have in common as opposed to the things that make them different from each other. And when we look at the things that high performers have in common, we find habits, traits, qualities that when other people build those into their lives, then they too can become high performers. So this book is sort of a user's manual for understanding the space between your ears and a blueprint to master your mind, accomplish any goal, and become the version of yourself that we all want to be. The title is it's a little bit bold and catchy, but there's a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, who discovered that 95% of our decisions are made based on how we feel in any given moment. So right away, that tells us, our mind is an incredibly valuable tool. It is either subconsciously running the show and directing us in ways that we don't know, or we can choose to understand it and master it so that we can become that version of ourselves that we want to be, so that we can be in control. Again, let's go back to these high performers, whether it's an Olympian or somebody who is an extremely successful endurance runner or a special forces operator. You're looking at somebody who over years, these things don't happen overnight, but over years, they've chosen to show up at the right time, do the right thing, eat the right way, train the right way. And day in and day out, there are opportunities for those folks to make choices that would lead them away from their ultimate goal. And, the bigger the goal, the longer it takes, the more opportunities we have for our mind to sort of hijack that route and lead us off course. So I would argue that the bigger our goal and the longer it will take us to get there, the more important it is to master our minds so that we can be in control of those decisions.
Do you have like an idea of how many decisions we make on a daily basis and how many we can control?
Well, I think we can control every decision that we make, and that would be a good question. I don't know how many we make. I'm gonna have to look that up. That's a great question. No one's asked me that yet.
Because a lot of it, you said it before, a lot of it is just unconscious.
Well, and that's the thing is, right? Like, how would we quantify, some of these subconscious decisions? There are so many operating systems running, underneath, and there's a good reason for that. I mean, there's so many things that we've decided, once, and then we just put that on cruise control, and then, we don't pay attention to that. So it would be like, okay, well, what shoes are you going to wear today? Well, if you're going to go out for a run, you're going to put on your running shoes. At some point, you made the decision once that if I'm going to run, these are the shoes I'm going to wear. Mm-hmm. And you don't think about that in the moment. But that is a decision to put those shoes on. It's a decision which socks you're going to wear, which shorts, which shirt, what course are you going to run, or what trail am I going to run today? What am I going to listen to when I run? How am I going to get there? Am I going to drive? Am I going to walk? Am I going to take public transportation? I mean, yeah, if you stop and think about it, there are tons of decisions that we make in a given day. But what I talk a lot about in the book is bringing in awareness to these decisions. So every single one of those tiny little decisions could be a deterrent that prevents us from doing the training run that we have on that day. And that's the bigger thing that I'm trying to help people with and understand, is that those things don't matter. What matters is if you ever want to be an Olympian, or if you ever want to be, this podium, athlete, you've got to show up and run regardless. if that means running in the wrong shoes, or if it means not wearing socks because you forgot to pack them, you run anyway, instead of saying, oh, well, I'm not going to work out today because I forgot to pack my socks. Mm-hmm. Right. But no, that's a really good question. I'm curious to find out if someone has been able to quantify the number of decisions we make every day.
Okay. Well, maybe we can listen to the answer in one of your podcasts and try to find it out. Yeah, I can imagine that. Like, for example, if you want to go out and buy a new car and spend $30,000 or $40,000 or euros on a car, that you're definitely going to do your research, and you're not going to take a decision just purely based on your feelings, and you're going to do some research. But like I had it today, I was doing my grocery shopping, and I had everything that was on my list, and I was waiting at the cash register, and then, you pass by the Snickers bars and the Mars bars, and then you're like, I feel like having a Mars bar. How do you got some strategies that we might use, like to shut down our feelings and stop, for example, that craving for that Mars bar, because that might, you maybe might be on a diet and taking that one Mars bar is not going to make you fat all over again, but it takes you away from your ultimate goal of losing weight. So what are some of the things that we can do to shut down our feelings and say, okay, I'm not going to have that Mars bar here today, and make a conscious decision?
Yep, that's a great question. So the first thing I would tell people, and I've told people this so many times over the years, is that, when you walk past the Snickers or the Mars bar in the store and your initial reaction is, oh my God, that looks good, I want one. And then your secondary reaction that comes about a second later is, oh wait, but I'm on a diet, or oh wait, but, and then fill in the blank with whatever reason, somebody is going to say I shouldn't do this, or I'm not going to. That first response, the one that hits instantly, is something called our limbic system. And we always have this negotiation or this kind of contrast, struggle for control going on in our brains between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, which is also called the neocortex. It is it's the more evolved portion of our brain. It is the one that is capable of executive function and thinking beyond the now. The limbic system, I like to call it sort of the hormone/ego-driven teenager that is incapable of thinking beyond the now. The limbic system cannot think beyond this moment. From a survival standpoint, we needed that years ago. And we still use it today in certain instances. If you and I are out on the trail and there's a snake 2 steps in front of us and you don't see it, before I can communicate, hey, there's a snake, stop, I'm going to slam on the brakes and put my arm in front of you and physically hold you back. And that happens much faster than I can consciously go through that thought process of saying, there's a snake, stop. Right. So that's an example where we can all sort of understand, how it would work and how it would be advantageous. So the first thing that I would tell somebody when they have that reaction to, seeing a pizza or, some baked good that, looks good, or the candy bar, it's a normal response. It's a normal reaction. That's part of our biology. That's how we're wired. But that second response is the one that we should probably listen to, because that's the executive brain. That's the one that is capable of thinking beyond this moment. And again, if we're ever going to become Richard Branson or Oprah or, this version of ourselves that is, the ultimate version of us, we've got to make decisions beyond, how we feel in this moment and what the limbic system or the ego wants right now. There have been a lot of studies that show people who are able to delay gratification end up making better grades, getting better jobs, having higher salaries, and ultimately, doing more with their lives. So with that understanding, we now have an awareness of what's going on. And, a big part of the book is developing an awareness practices that help us train awareness. And awareness is what gives us choice, because now we can look at this candy bar and we can understand why we had that response. We don't feel bad about having that response. We don't beat ourselves up for saying, oh, I'm such an idiot. Why do I always want, why do these cravings always get me? And why do I always feel this way when I see these things? Because it's normal, we know it looks good, it tastes good, but now we can bring awareness to that choice, and we can say, well, okay, it looks good and it might taste good. And you're right, I'm not going to get fat in one day or by eating one of these things. But what are my values and where am I trying to get long term? And what we all need to do in advance of those situations is lay out our own values and have whether you want to call them rules or systems in place that help make those decisions easier. So, for example, one of my personal values around food is that I don't eat anything with added sugar. So there's no way I'm eating that candy bar. That's not even a slippery slope. If I was to say, oh, let's say I didn't have that value in place, then I could say, oh, well, one candy bar is not going to make me fat. So I might buy it and eat it. Well, the next time I walk past that candy bar, I may have the same response, and again, and again, and again. And then it compounds over time. So, it's rarely one decision that leads us, way off course or leads us ultimately to becoming, the next Richard Branson or whoever you want to insert as, where you want to get with your life. Rather, it is the sum of all of those decisions and all of those actions. It's all of the little things. Did you wake up on time? Did you get this workout in, every single day? And so that's why being able to zoom out and bring an awareness to each decision and, each day, each week, each month, each year, and sort of look at things with that perspective of, is this in line with my values? And is this the decision that the person I want to be would make?
How can you, keep that awareness alive? Because most of the time, you do things just, because you're on autopilot. And you might think you might walk past that Mars bar and you think, okay, no, I'm on a diet, I'm not going to have it. And then, 5 minutes later, you're filling your car with gas and you want to go into the shop and you buy a liter of water and there's a waffle there and you're like, okay, I'm going to have that waffle. And you forget about that awareness decision that you made 5 minutes ago.
Right. I mean, and that's the practice of being aware. And it takes a long, long time to develop that and to hone it and craft it the way we want. This is another reason that I really like to focus on values as opposed to motivation. So the motivation may wane, in those 5 minutes or 30 minutes or, over the course of a day or whatever. Motivation doesn't last. But our values are not something that, they're not that dynamic. They're pretty static. So whatever my values are today, they're probably going to be my values tonight, and they're probably going to be there tomorrow. So I like to encourage people to define those things. What are the words that you want to define you? How do you want to move through life? Who's the person that you want to be? And then begin to act as if you were that person. The fastest way to become that version of yourself is to act that way. Be that person. Act as if you already were. And make decisions in line with and act in alignment with that version of yourself. And the book outlines a lot of tools that we can use to I guess the word would be to hone this awareness and to make it something that is more at the forefront and less of something that we have to hope that we remember to be aware. Things like meditation or breathing or yoga. A lot of these are also parasympathetic or recovery activities. And what's really interesting is that there is research showing that the higher our HRV or our heart rate variability, the greater our emotional resiliency. So, when our heart rate variability is high, when our emotional resiliency is high, we have better decision making. If people are struggling to believe that or understand that, just think about the last time you had a red eye flight, or you stayed up all night, you were sleep deprived, or if you're a parent and you've had a young child and you're not getting sleep, the day after not getting sleep that you're more irritable, your decision making is clouded, and you're a lot more likely to do things that are not aligned with your stated goals or your stated values. So what's really interesting is that many of these activities that we could view as physical recovery tools are also mental and emotional recovery tools that can help us keep our heart rate variability or our vagal tone high, which preserves that emotional bandwidth and decision-making ability.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that we should keep track of then.
Yeah, I think, if we're looking at quantifiable metrics, heart rate variability is definitely one to track.
Okay, I'll put those links up as well, because I had some talks about with previous guests about heart rate variability, and we've got some links there to the tools that you can use there. Going back to the book, I mean, you've lent me a copy there on a digital copy, just doing the research for the podcast, and I've been able to quickly scan through it and read a couple of chapters, and as you mentioned, that there's so many tools in there, and I'm definitely ordering a copy and a hard copy for my own personal use. So thanks for writing the book, and thanks for sharing your wisdom here on the podcast. How can people get in touch with you if they want to, Ryan? Excuse me.
The best way to get in touch with me would be through my website, ryanmunsey.com. And for personal social media, I'm most active on Instagram, and that is at @RyanMunsey_. And then, of course, our podcast is the Better Human Project, and betterhumanproject.org is the website. betterhumanproject.org with an underscore is where we are on Instagram. So any of those will bring you back to me and what we're doing.
Yeah, okay, cool. And the book, of course, is available on Amazon and all major booksellers.
Well, so far just Amazon. We'll hope one day all other major booksellers, but we're working on that. If enough people go buy it and we have enough demand for it, we may be able to get Barnes and Noble and some of the other ones to pick it up.
Okay, but Amazon so far, that's good. Well, final question to finish this off. If you could sit on a bench somewhere and chat for an hour with anyone from the past or the present, who would it be and why?
Oh man, that's a great question. Wow. When I grew up, I was a huge fan of Michael Jordan. I think it'd be fun to sit on a bench and talk to him. I'd love to sit down and talk to Jordan for an hour.
Yeah, that would be cool. Maybe you should reach out to him and have him on the podcast.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, I think he's one of those guys that's hard to get a hold of.
Yeah, he's pretty busy these days, but you never know. It might happen.
Yeah, okay. I'll keep an eye on it. Thanks for your time, Ryan.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
Okay, Junkies, you've reached the end of yet another episode of the Endurance Junkie podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Ryan Munsey for coming on. And make sure to visit the show notes page on junkiepodcast.com for all the links and resources. Now, if you like these little interviews and don't want to miss any future episodes, just head over to iTunes or Stitcher and simply subscribe to the show. And if you've got a couple of minutes, I would also appreciate a rating and review there. 5-star preferably, thank you very much, as that will help spread the word and grow the show. We're also available on Spotify, so if that's your preferred medium, just search for Endurance Junkie Podcast in the search bar, and you will find me no problem. Alright, thanks again, and I hope you'll join me next time. Cheers.